Well, first off, I want to say thank you to the genius behind the camera. One of the things that I've learned over the years, and actually it was emphasized when I interviewed a brother on one of my podcast platforms, and he's a stunt motorcycle rider. And I always ask people to give shout outs up front before we get into an interview. And he said, well, it's funny you do that because on all the movies that he's been in as a motorcycle rider, he mentioned that all the important people get mentioned up front. And so that kind of gave validation to this thing that, I kind of innately started to do with regard to giving gratitude up front before getting into a conversation. So first and foremost, I want to give you a shout out from behind the camera because you a genius, brother. Just watching you set up, just kind of, I gravitate to people who are operating in their genius or operating in their gift, and you can see something and how they operate. The meticulousness of how you move behind the camera just says something about your commitment to the craft. And so to that, I say thank you before we jump into, a little chat here about, I guess about me, you know what I'm saying? And so thank you, Ronald Levy. I know you're not trying to make any noise behind the camera. It's all good. But man, I want to say thank you because this is an opportunity for me to share a little bit about who I am, my story. And usually over the years, I've been accustomed to interviewing people or just giving thoughts or dropping nuggets of information or wisdom that I think would be applicable in the lives of other people. But I rarely just sit down and just tell my story. And as we kind of navigate into the next phase of life, for me as a personal development or peak performance coach, I think it's important for individuals to get context on who I am, what I'm coming to the table with, and the value that I bring. You know what I'm saying? Because if you can't connect the dots there, then ultimately, it's going to be hard for you to connect the dots with regard to being able to help people, in transformational, changes that need to happen in their life. So when I think about myself, again, I'm Mike Dorsey. Well, maybe I didn't say that up front. My name is Mike Dorsey. A lot of people call me Coach Mike D. And, who I am now has been a process of kind of evolving, right? And to get to where you are now, in a lot of instances, you have to take a step back. And for me, it's really about taking it back to before me, right? To the things that led to the environment that I came up in. And when I look at it, there are kind of four themes that have really always been consistent in my life. And those four themes are consistency, faith, family, and education. And as you kind of get a glimpse of what came before me, you'll see what I'm talking about. And, I'm originally from Augusta, Georgia, born and raised. And, what's interesting, I can trace back probably almost 4 generations back to the Augusta, Georgia area. And when I mention, again, consistency, faith, family, and education, the theme of consistency shows up even back to the level of my great grandparents. And when I mention consistency, is interesting. All 8 or all 4 sets of my great grandparents were married until the date that they died, right? So again, it's that level of consistency. My grandparents were married until their death, right? My parents are still married. And the reason I said that is because when you start thinking about the themes that show up in your life, a lot of times it's not what you're taught or what you're told, is what you witness and what you experience. And so for me, that showed consistency being a dominant theme in my life, even if things aren't perfect. So just because people stay married does not mean that everything is obviously perfect, but me being in an environment in which that level of consistency goes back multiple generations subconsciously informs who you are and informs perspective and informs values, right? I mentioned the concept of faith, going back multiple generations, our families have been, or my family has been very much involved in faith. One of my great grandfathers was a minister. I have an uncle that's a minister and, various cousins that are ministers now as well. But faith has always been the cornerstone of my family for generations, right? Education, 3 out of 4 of my grandparents actually went to college. 2 out of 4 of them achieved master's degrees, which in the 1940s and 50s for Black folks in Georgia, again, is something that is very much uncommon, right? Especially from the level of consistency. So again, family, faith, consistency, and education were themes that basically informed the environment that I grew up in. And that also led to my parents both being college educated and us growing up, my brothers and I growing up in an environment where college education was something that was not an if you go, but we had conversations from when we were really young about where you're going. What do you want to major in? What do you want to do with your life? That was a common theme growing up. But again, this is a framework that was set for generations prior to me even being thought about. And I said that to say that a lot of times, if we want to understand where we're going from a forward trajectory, we have to take a look back. And by taking a look back, it forces you to reflect not only on you, but the environments that are around you. There's a concept called epigenetics. And epigenetics really just states or really talks about the fact that your genes, how they express, that is influenced by in essence, the environment that those genes are in. So the environment that you grow up in kind of influences the action. It influences the perspectives. It also influences how you operate. And to me, in my life, that set the framework for a trajectory that I was on. But what's interesting, and we'll kind of dive into this as we move along, it was a trajectory that was set for me, but it wasn't always necessarily the trajectory that was fully aligned with me, right? And that's where self-discovery kind of came in later in life. So again, I mentioned growing up in Augusta, Georgia, and one of the things that I came to understand about myself was I was kind of the jack of all trades type dude, right? Where there was never really a situation in which I was ever the best. So I might have been one of the better athletes on the football team, but I was never the best athlete. I might have had, pretty good grades in the class, but I was never the star student or the top grade in the class. When it came to other events, I may have done okay or maybe been above average in some instances, but I never experienced being that one or the dude or the all everything person in any particular area. I was always the guy who could scratch the surface. And what's interesting, as you look back, there was always this common narrative that was utilized about people who were kind of the jack of all trades. And it was stated that the jack of all trades is a master of none. And the interesting perspective about that was it kind of helped to highlight the fact that someone who was either a generalist or someone who can scratch the surface on a lot of areas, how that was kind of looked down upon. And the value proposition for a person with that perspective is to find something that you're good at and specialize and become the best in something. And what's interesting about that was not too long ago, and again, I'm jumping forward to eventually take it back, for the storyline perspective. Not too long ago, I came across another perspective of that particular quote of a jack of all trades is a master of none. And it was actually written in reference to William Shakespeare. And what it stated was a jack of all trades is a master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. So what that quote reference or the new interpretation actually stated, it actually highlighted the fact that being a jack of all trades was actually a value proposition. It was actually giving credit to that person who was a jack of all trades versus telling them that, hey, you don't need to focus on a lot of things. You need to hyper focus on one thing, do that one thing, and that's where your value is going to be seen in the world. And so I just came across that quote not too long ago. And the thing that's interesting about it, I wish that had been something that maybe was highlighted as I was coming up, because being someone who was maybe good or above average in a lot of different areas, I never felt like I was a peak performer. I thought I was good, but never a peak performer. And what's interesting, My latest book is the 33 Laws of Impact and Fulfillment. It's your peak performance guide to leading from within. The thing that's interesting about that and why this thing connects so much with me is my dominant narrative growing up and really up until the last few years, if I'm going to be completely honest, was always about being, kind of a generalist and somewhat okay here and somewhat okay there, and never really understanding that in itself is a value proposition. It wasn't until a few years ago that I understood that kind of the jack of all trades, or being able to scratch the surface across the board, opened up the window for me to be able to connect with a lot of people across multiple industries, to have something that I could reference to help them look at something from a different angle, and then also potentially intersect that with another opportunity so that they can then accelerate their life and ultimately become the best version of who they were called to be, right? Living their full potential. And so when I look back to growing up, that was one of the things that I never really had the feeling of being the best at anything, but I also didn't have that wherewithal to understand that having all of these different experiences, being in different organizations, being in the Boy Scouts and being, playing sports and all of that, I didn't see the value proposition that all of them together helped me to then materialize into who I'm supposed to be. And these were all little pieces to my ultimate puzzle. You know what I'm saying? And so that, with the examples that were kind of set with consistency and education and faith and family, it was less about me as a kid going through the process of discovery of understanding who I am and where I bring value, and more about, okay, you follow these particular trajectories and that will lead you to a consistent and safe and successful life, which there's nothing wrong with that. But the thing is, I never questioned that until I became an adult. Okay. And so that being said, as a kid, I was always the one who just, okay, this is the playbook to success. All right, I follow that. Okay, this is what someone is doing and they make this kind of money. Oh, that's interesting. I'll go in that direction. Never really taking time to understand, is that in alignment with me? Is that in alignment with the gifts that I have? Is that in alignment with the calling that I have on my life? And that being said, it made me kind of feel like a follower. You know what I'm saying? Because yes, I may have led a discussion or been a president of some, board or something in middle school or high school. But the reality was, I never felt like I was fully leading from within and leading with the gifts, the talents and skills that, I was fully blessed with. And that being said, if we kind of look at now and the creation of my last project, it's really all about helping individuals unlock. It's really about helping individuals see the full potential that they have, but also doing so through an authentic lens. Dr. Miles Monroe talks about your original truth, and your original truth will shock you and amaze everybody else. And the thing that's so interesting about that, very few of us take time to discover our original truth. And so for some that maybe come from, solid family backgrounds or great inspirations and all, and great, mentors and all, a lot of times we come up in environments in which we're not challenged to become our best. We're encouraged to follow the path to success. We're encouraged to follow, the path that's been set or been laid out for you. We're encouraged to, look and find best practices from somebody, which is good to learn from others. But most importantly, we have to take a look in the mirror and understand whether or not that pathway is in alignment with us. And a lot of us don't have the courage and the confidence, if we're fully honest about it, to pursue that. And so for me, that's one of the driving forces inside of me, is really understanding and seeing individuals who have capacity, who have potential, and finding ways to help them to dive into who they are authentically, but really to develop the courage and the confidence to lean into that. Because if we really are honest about it, if we follow the playbook that someone else sets, the best case scenario is we'll be number two, right? But if we take a step back and say, you know what, I am uniquely made, and we are all divinely and uniquely made in our own way, in our own rights, right? We have something that nobody has ever seen before because they've never seen you before. Even if you have an identical twin, you're still your own person, right? You're still going to have your own experiences. And we have to get to the point of having leverage or having the courage and the confidence to leverage that so that we can fully make our investment into society, but then also an investment into ourselves. And so that's the whole concept behind impact and fulfillment. You know, a lot of people stress impact. You know, impact is basically the delta of your involvement. So how things change by you being involved is impact. But we can't forget about fulfillment. And fulfillment is that through line of joy that you have associated with whatever it is you're doing. And this doesn't have to be something professional, right? This could be, you know, a side project. This could be your, you know, your volunteer work. This could be, you know, just a hobby that you have. But you have to seek impact and fulfillment because then the best version of you is offered to the world. And the world benefits when all of us identify that thing and we're able to bring the level of energy necessary so that that thing manifests into something that helps other people. Because again, we're not going to be here forever. So whether you have kids or not, I'm fortunate and blessed to have, you know, 2 kids with my wife, Maisha. And so, you know, hopefully the things that I do will help create a pathway for them to ultimately walk in their purpose, you know what I'm saying, and do their thing. But then also, hopefully millions of people around the world can take some lesson from or a nugget from what's being done and do the same. And if we all start operating that way, the generations improve continuously over time versus us having to, you know, stop the destruction because we're not doing that. And so, you know, so that's kind of the premise behind who I am and kind of a rationale or reasoning behind the, you know, my latest book, The 33 Laws of Impact and Fulfillment. It's just like, I really get sick and tired of seeing folks who have all the potential in the world not realize it. I get sick and tired of people, you know, who know that they can do better, choose not to. You know what I'm saying? It's just like, take a chance, you know, try it. You literally are wired in a way that you are a one of one. There's nobody that's ever been here that is you, and there will never be another you again. You can have a copy. Somebody can copy and paste what you do. There'll never be you again. So why not take all of that and do something with it? Again, it doesn't have to impact millions of people. It could be, you know, all about you just doing something that brings you joy and brings a neighbor joy. Who cares, right? But find that thing and do it well, because that then gives you the energy to propel forward. And ultimately, to me, that's what it's all about. And that's the whole, to me, it's like the meaning of life. You know what I'm saying? Yes, my faith is extremely important, and really understanding and having a relationship, you know, with God is extremely important to me. But then next is really understanding who I am and carrying out the mission that I was called to carry out, and finding unique ways to do that. And so ultimately, man, you know, as a kid, when I was growing up, I never really felt like I was fully there. You know what I'm saying? And it's interesting because there were, you know, a lot of situations and circumstances from the standpoint of, you know, being in groups and going into programs and all of that. And sometimes it was just busy work, right? Or it's just something to keep, you know, your mind occupied and keep yourself busy. But the reality was, these were all pieces to the puzzle, which helped to add to the diversity of my experience set as well. And again, it's taken time to understand that all of these things are basically this 500-piece puzzle, which helped to make up who I am. And I'm incomplete without all of them, but I'm not defined by any one of them either. Okay. And so moving forward a little bit, it's interesting. After high school, I ended up going to Georgia Tech, and I ultimately got a degree in economics, but I went to Georgia Tech with the goal of majoring in mechanical engineering and getting my pre-med prerequisites and going to medical school. Why was I thinking that? Well, I chose to major in mechanical engineering not because of a deep dive that I did. I took physics as a senior in high school and did pretty well, and I heard somebody else talking about mechanical engineering. I was like, hey, that sounds cool. You need physics, don't you? Let's do it. So that was the reason for me choosing to major in mechanical engineering. I also was going to get my pre-med prerequisites. Why was I going to do that? Because most of the people in my circle, or most of the people that I saw around me that had monetary success, that were really revered in the community, I saw doctors and lawyers. I was like, yeah, I didn't want to be a lawyer. So you know what? I'm going to go to medical school. So pre-med prerequisites, majoring in mechanical engineering, going to Georgia Tech. Really, it had zero alignment with who I was. And it was the first time that a misalignment really kind of slapped me in the face, because I got to Georgia Tech and ultimately before college, pretty good student, mid 3 point something GPA, pretty good on the SAT and all, and kind of a diverse set of experiences, which made me a good candidate to go to Georgia Tech. But when I got there, I hit the fan. I mean, it hit the fan literally from an academic perspective. My first term at Georgia Tech, my GPA was a 1.91. I remember it vividly. 1.91. I had an A in a 2 credit hour class, a C in a 5-hour credit class, and a D in another 5-hour credit class, which allowed me to have a 1.91 GPA. Academically, I had never performed like that before. So I went from a 1.91 GPA, again, majoring in something that I had no business majoring in. It just sounded good. Picking something from a pre-med prerequisite perspective that just kind of sounded good, but really was not in alignment with me. That caused my stuff to hit the fan from an academic perspective. I went from that 1.91 to being on academic warning, to academic probation, to ultimately academic suspension, where they cut all of my financial aid. And so literally I was going to get kicked out of school. And, the blessing of it all was I had a grandmother I could call. And I called my grandmother and told her what was going on. She actually paid my tuition that semester. And that was the only reason I stayed in college that semester, because she was able to pay my tuition. Ultimately, they reinstated my financial aid. So I paid her back and, I was able to move forward. And I ultimately changed my major to economics because I enjoyed economics and I felt business would be something that I would move into. But the thing is, it was that tale of understanding that being misaligned has ramifications. And that was kind of the first instance in which misalignment kind of showed or reared its ugly head in my life. And what's interesting about that, going forward in college, I had another situation in which misalignment, and I'm talking misalignment a lot because I think alignment is key when it comes to pursuing what it is you're supposed to pursue in life and doing what it is you're supposed to do in life. A little later in college, towards the end of my junior into my senior year in college, I actually started dating someone. And what's interesting about that, that was a lot of misalignment as well. But it was one of those things where growing up, the model for me had always kind of been set. I find somebody who's successful and follow the playbook and network and build relationships and try to get in that direction. But it was not a lot of me doing the deep dive into who I am. So even as it pertained to dating growing up, you have relationships and all, but you don't have the wherewithal to understand, is this person in alignment with who I am? Are we equally yoked, so to speak? And again, this is another example of how something reared its ugly head. So I had a romantic relationship with somebody going into my senior year in college, and that relationship lasted about a year and a half. But all throughout that relationship, there were examples in which there was complete misalignment. But for me, a person who's never done the deep dive into who I was, I either didn't have the self-awareness enough, or I was not paying attention to a lot of the indicators enough to realize that this was not going anywhere fast. And so after graduation from college, I got a job in Atlanta. It didn't work out too well. Long story short, I ended up having to move from Atlanta to Tennessee. And when I moved from Atlanta to Tennessee after college, I was still in that relationship, but the distance that was now in the relationship caused a humongous fracture. And it led to a whole lot of turmoil and a lot of things that really basically challenged me on a very deep level, right? It was a situation where, you know, I'm not going to go into specifics or details on what actually happened, but it was some very traumatic situations that, you know, were very much life threatening, and it just wasn't a good look. But going back to it, in the very beginning, there was not alignment. And so by me not being aligned with that person and not having the wherewithal to make the proper adjustments, you know, up front, it led to a lot of heartache, a lot of trauma, a lot of drama, and a lot of issues that, long story short, I'm thankful to still be here. Okay. I'll leave it at that. But again, as I mentioned earlier, pieces to the puzzle, going through that drama and trauma of that relationship was something that kind of helped to inform me, and not knowing that I would ultimately become a peak performance or personal development coach 20 years later, it gives me the wherewithal and the ability to connect with individuals who might be going through challenging circumstances as it pertains to relationships. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not a relationship therapist. I'm not a therapist. I've had to go through therapy, you know, at times, which is a good thing. I had a guy, actually, he's a mentor of mine. His name is Sean Dove. One of the things that he mentions is if you don't have a therapist, a coach, and a mentor, you're going to struggle leading at the highest levels. And I fully believe that. Okay. But I said all that to say misalignment led to that particular relationship drama. And I'll tell you too, when I moved to Tennessee, which is away from my family nucleus. So my family nucleus was Augusta, Georgia. I went to Georgia Tech, which is in Atlanta. And that was kind of the, you know, I'm close enough to my family to kind of be the family nucleus there as well. But when I ultimately moved to Tennessee, where I had no family, didn't know anybody, that was the moment where I was really forced to grow up. And that was the moment where I also had to really look myself in the mirror and understand who I was. Because ultimately, up until that point, I was really never challenged to look in the mirror and figure out who I was independently as a man. And so that's why a lot of times if I reference my experience, I'll say that I was born and raised in Augusta, Georgia, but I actually grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I didn't grow up in Knoxville, Tennessee until I was actually grown. So I moved here when I was 23 years old. So it's interesting. Most people say I was born, raised, and I grew up in a certain place. I kind of flip it a little bit. I was born and raised in Augusta, Georgia, but I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee after I was already an adult. And that's because I was forced at that point to really understand who I was, to challenge who I was, to challenge my thought process, to really do the deep work on understanding what are the driving factors, what are the triggers, what are the things that, you know, really motivate me to be who it is I'm supposed to be. And I think that's an interesting perspective, because I am a huge proponent of doing the deep work for us to understand who we are. But I'm also on a mission to get us to think about that a lot earlier in the process. And so if we start to think about that in our own lives at an earlier process, what ends up happening is we then put ourselves in a position to help our kids go through that deep dive, that deep work at an earlier process, and potentially avoid some of the challenges and pitfalls that come from being misaligned with people and opportunities. And we see it day in and day out with various celebrities and people, who are in the news. A lot of the challenges come because they have a crew around them in which they're misaligned with. And that crew does not help to bring out the best in them. That crew ultimately doesn't challenge them. You know, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had a quote. I believe it was from Letters from a Birmingham Jail, but don't quote me on where it came from, but I remember reading it about him. He said that where there is no great disappointment, where there's first no great love. So basically what that's saying, or what he was saying, was I can't be disappointed in something that I don't love. And so if you have a crew or people around you or advisors who are in alignment with who you are and really want you to be your best, they actually love you, they'll be disappointed when you're not on your mission. They'll be disappointed when you're not living up to your full potential, and they'll actually challenge and call you out on that. And so to that point, that's where I started to understand myself. I started to understand the people that I was hanging out with. But it didn't come until I was forced to do so. And that came after, again, the trauma and drama of a failed relationship, one, but then two, the notion of being kind of in isolation and living on my own in an area that I didn't have family to lean on. And I didn't at the time have a lot of close friends to lean on either. You know what I'm saying? I had to go through it, but I'm better for it. And by me going through it there, it helps to now equip you to help other people who need to ultimately go through a particular process of growth, of evolution, of, becoming who it is you're supposed to be from an authentic place, right? And the ultimate goal is for you to then pursue life through that. Relationships, opportunities, everything, not trying to match what's out there, but trying to bring who you are and finding things that match to what you bring so that you all can create synergy. The definition of synergy is the sum is greater than the parts. And so fast forward a little bit, after doing a lot of the deep work and going through the trauma and drama and all of that, the best thing that happened to me was I ultimately met my wife. And what's interesting about that, we did not meet on our own. We were actually hooked up. So I have to give a shout out to my godmother, Pam, who basically played Cupid to hook my wife and I up. And so long story short, after going through what I went through from a relationship perspective and all of that, and coming into understanding who I was, that was the point in which the opportunity presented itself for me to meet my wife. And I'll tell you, that has been the greatest thing ever, because we're able to date and then to get married and now bring two beautiful children into the world. But also, she helped me to open up from a travel perspective. And again, this goes back to the whole notion of all of these pieces to the puzzle, which open up the window to you becoming the best version of who it is you're supposed to be. Growing up, we didn't travel a whole lot. We took road trips, within a few hours of Augusta here or there. But, I didn't take my first flight until I was 21 years old. You know what I'm saying? And so that was like an interesting perspective, because travel was not necessarily prioritized when I was growing up. Again, consistency, family, faith, and education, that's what you focus on. Travel wasn't a part of that. You know what I'm saying? And so that opened me up to seeing different parts of the country. And then ultimately, getting my passport, we started seeing different parts of the world, visiting parts of Europe and Africa and, the Middle East and the Caribbean and Canada and, again, all throughout the US, and being able to explore and see different people from different cultures, from different backgrounds. Again, these are all pieces to the puzzle, which help to open up this window into what's possible. Because a lot of what we see via media, a lot of what we see or what we read about, those are curated narratives by someone who has an agenda. Whereas you go to the place that they're talking about and you come to realize that, this is really not what they talked about. This is not exactly how people act over here. They're not mean. They're actually just as cool as the guy down the street. But you don't see that until you go and you travel. Again, travel has been one of those aha moments for myself, because it opens up this bridge of connection to being able to leverage relationships, but also understand human nature and understand and study people. Because when you can understand and study people and you see the connectivity, that through line that bridges us all together, it helps you to open up and understand that the world, even though it's close to 8 billion people, is very, very small, because most people are looking to accomplish some of the same things in life. You want safety, you want security, you want your family to be cool, you want to have fun, you want to laugh, you want to cry together, you want to have community, right? And that's the same narrative that you see no matter where you go around the world. But until you go and set foot there and connect with individuals from these places, you don't see that. But again, these are all pieces to the puzzle which help to inform my mindset and my perspective. You know what I'm saying? And so that's been, to me, an eye-opening moment to help for growth, development, and evolving into the person that I am today. That being said, a lot of these experiences, again, come into play to help inform who I am. And some of those experiences along the way have been professional. So like I mentioned, I went to Georgia Tech, and my first job out of college, I did IT sales. I only did that for a couple of months and I was let go. It was crazy. Like, there 3 or 4 months and ended up buying a car and got an apartment and all of that. And then 3.5 months in, hey, Mike, we got to let you go. Like, oh, this is quite interesting. This is the real world. But again, that experience is what opened up the window for me to get the opportunity to move to Tennessee, which I had no intention of doing. But then moving to Tennessee, I was in a position with a company that's in an industry that I don't support. So I'm not going to give the name of the company, but you can probably put 2 and 2 together and figure it out. I was hired into the tobacco industry. I never smoked cigarettes. I was not a cigarette smoker, but I needed a job, right? And so I was in sales, got a position, and they relocated me to Knoxville, Tennessee. Again, I knew nobody here. The thing that was interesting about it was it helped me to understand the fact that you can't sell something effectively that you do not support. You know what I'm saying? And so when it comes to the level of conviction, it gave me this understanding as I help individuals through changes, as I help individuals through, opportunities and scenarios in life, that alignment, and this is one of the core themes that we talked about earlier, is extremely important. Because if you're not aligned with the thing that you are selling and or promoting, yes, you may achieve some level of success, but you'll never achieve the success that you're capable of because you don't have alignment there. That is extremely key. That's a humongous, notion to be mindful of. So I went from that to then getting into the pharmaceutical industry, which ultimately, towards the end of college really was my goal from a job perspective. And that was inspired because I had an uncle that I really, really looked up to. I still look up to as my guy. But he was in the pharmaceutical industry. He was making the kind of money that I wanted. And again, growing up, I did not do a deep dive into who I was. It was more about who had the playbook to getting to a particular place and let me follow that playbook. And so again, that was my inspiration for getting into the pharmaceutical industry. And I spent about 11 years in the pharmaceutical industry. Great experience, right? From a financial perspective, from an understanding business and corporate America perspective, it was cool. I got to travel and meetings and company cars and all of that. But again, it was one of those things where this is a piece to the puzzle, but that was not my destiny. That was not what I was called to do. But some of the things that I picked up while being in that industry helped to inform my thought process so that I can connect and help others who maybe are called in to some corporate arena or some corporate area to ultimately, gain their peak performance or to optimize who they are. I can have a bridge of connection there because I was there. You know what I'm saying? And so, so I had some other, professional positions in healthcare, recruiting of physicians and doing home healthcare sales. So I had some other areas there, but the thing that I ultimately came back to understanding was that I am supposed to do something much bigger. And I never knew exactly what that was, but it was always this thing inside of me of something is supposed to be done that's bigger than what you're doing. And when I say bigger, not necessarily from a financial perspective, but bigger from the standpoint of being fully in alignment with who you are. And because of that, it never allowed me to fully give my all in any of my professional endeavors. You know what I'm saying? Like, I was always good enough to be ranked pretty well and to keep my job and to do all right. But the level of fulfillment was not there. Again, the core theme of the book, my latest book, The 33 Laws of Impact and Fulfillment, one of the core themes is fulfillment. Again, you can be making impact, but are you fulfilled? And if you're not fulfilled, you have to ask yourself why. And part of this comes back to my personal story. Again, I was doing well financially. It was cool. You're working for reputable companies and company cars and 401ks, etc. But the level of fulfillment wasn't there. And so ultimately, when I was on my last assignment, there was a layoff that happened there. And when that layoff happened, it was basically an opportunity for me to say, all right, it's time to go and walk this path. And again, it's been challenging, but I will say it's also been very fulfilling, because when you understand who you are and you understand why you were placed on this earth, and you're able to walk in that daily, then it gives you fuel to continue going in a way that other people really can't understand. But it also gives you fuel that those who are walking in it can walk by you and get it, because they understand it. When they're walking in their purpose, and my whole thing is, I don't really care what a person is doing from a vocational perspective, from a professional perspective, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're working in corporate America, whether you're a nonprofit, whether you're stay-at-home mom, whether you're stay-at-home dad, whatever you may be doing, right? My biggest thing, or my mission, is just making sure that you are living your authentic truth. Are you literally walking in purpose? And for me, the 33 Laws of Impact and Fulfillment, the Peak Performance Guide to Leading from Within, is really all about that. It's not about, again, a financial number. It's all about, is this in alignment with who you are? And if you're misaligned, it's going to lead to challenges and issues that you don't need, because life's going to bring its own challenges. There's no need for us to, in essence, add unnecessary challenges into the mix. You know what I'm saying? And so yeah, man, I just kind of wanted to give a framework for my mindset and my thought process behind, doing this project. I've had 2 previous books before this. My first book was called Abe, Always Be Engaged, The 7 Keys to Living a Fit Urban Life. And that was in a time frame in which I was really committed to getting my health in check, right? To really getting in really good shape. And so I wanted to share some of the processes that I went through to, in essence, get there. My second book was called The Dynamic Black Fatherhood Manifesto. And that one coincided with my second podcast platform, which is called Black Fathers Now. And what's interesting, and I'll kind of sidebar a little bit, I created Black Fathers Now as an opportunity to, in essence, celebrate Black fatherhood, to celebrate, men that are doing amazing things, but to also give a shout out to a demographic that really doesn't get a lot of love, so to speak. But what was interesting in doing Black Fathers Now, there was this subconscious thing that I didn't even realize was brewing. And it was me needing to heal from challenges that I had with my father growing up. And what's so interesting about that did not really come to the light until I got to the end of doing the series. And so I did 300 episodes of Black Fathers Now before rebranding and, becoming Impact and Fulfillment with Coach Mike D. But the 300th episode was an episode that I did with my father. And it was powerful because it was like this full circle moment that I had to come to understand that I needed to heal personally, but then I also had to get to a point where I could do that so I could fully walk in my purpose. And so it's an interesting perspective. Again, life happens in a way that if you pay attention to, I say it's the Holy Spirit, but some people might say it's something else is moving inside of them. But if you pay attention to that little voice that's inside of you to operate and act when you're supposed to act, and you're in alignment, you will take steps that don't always make sense when you're taking the step, but when you look back, it all lines up and makes sense. That's why they say hindsight is 20/20. And so ultimately, man, now it's just all about really walking in purpose. And my purpose in life is to encourage, empower, and enhance individuals to maximum impact and fulfillment. Literally, that's why I'm here. Whether it's a corporate setting, whether it's an individual, whether it's a high-level celebrity peak performer, or whether it's a brother or a sister or any random person in line at the grocery store, I'm called to encourage, empower, and enhance. And that's why I'm here. That's why I was born. And it's taken almost 43 years to finally get to the understanding of my clear purpose. But now that I have it, you'll never see me leave it. You know what I'm saying? Because I've done the deep work, and this is what I'm made to do. And so, if anybody wants a copy of the book, The 33 Laws of Impact and Fulfillment, Amazon, you can go to coachmiked.com, grab a copy, and yeah, man, if you want to work with me, literally visit coachmiked.com and holler at me, man. Literally, I'm here, and this is what I'm made for. And so, yeah.